Now, let me say a very good afternoon to a man that many of you on social media certainly are already familiar with. But if you're not familiar with him, let's meet him now. His name is Zuby, and he's here. Zuby, a very good afternoon to you. Welcome.
How's it going, Mike?
Yeah, very well indeed. Very well indeed. Now, listen, I didn't really find out about you until relatively recently, but I watched an interview that you'd done. I started following you on Twitter, and I was very inspired by some of the things that you've said. Tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are in this day and age, and why you're so sensible, because not many people are these days.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you. I appreciate the kind words. So I am, wow, where do I even begin? So I'm an independent rapper, podcaster, entrepreneur, public speaker, coach. I do a whole bunch of things. I was actually born in the UK. I grew up in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. I went to an American school out there for several years. So if anyone's curious about the accent, that's where it's from. Okay. I came back to the UK, went to school in the UK for several years. I did very well in school, went to Oxford University, studied computer science, started making music when I was there. I released my first album actually in 2006, totally independently. And I've been a full-time musician since 2011, and I've just added more and more strings to the bow over time. At the beginning of 2019, I had a post go viral online where I identified as a woman and broke the British women's deadlift record, which went very, very seriously viral nationally. So my audience has just gone up by I don't know how many factors since that time. So The past 18 months have been pretty crazy.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting, call that a very interesting 15 years. Have you noticed how the world, certainly our world, has changed in 15 years? Because if I go back all the way to 2005, I was doing something very different. I was working for a newspaper in those days. I was just about to be fired, and I was about to start a radio career that I didn't even know I was going to have, which I'm very happy about now. But the world was very different then. You know, people seem to have become so intolerant of one another. We've become more tribal, it seems to me. You've spoken about this quite a lot because you see it, I think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very weird. And I think that it's not by accident that timing coincides with the rise of smartphones and the rise of social media.
Yeah.
You mentioned 2005. And I mean, I believe the first iPhone came out in 2006.
Right.
So I think what we're seeing right now is we're living through the greatest social experiment perhaps in history, right? The fact that we are connected to hundreds of thousands, millions of people at the touch of a button. I mean, I have over almost 500,000 followers on social media, and the fact that I can reach 500,000 people from a device in my pocket is totally insane. It's incredible. It's an incredible power, and I've been able to do some wonderful things with it. But I don't think that we really appreciate what we're dealing with here, and the way it changes people's behavior and the way people communicate and interact. There's a lot of positive to it, but on the net, I think thus far it might actually be something that's negative for our society on the whole.
It's interesting actually you say that, because looking at your most of your posts on Twitter, they are very positive. You know, some people might say they're a bit arrogant, but I like all that, because that's what I do as well, right? And you have a lot more reason to be arrogant than I do. But the point is that, you know, the more positive you are, the more positivity comes from that, it seems to me. And the more negative you are, the more negativity comes from that. So we have to fight. I think people like you and I have to kind of fight together for positivity. You know, I'm one of those people that wants, you know, when I look at, I look at a glass, I see it half full, I don't see it half empty. And your tweets, I mean, let me read this. Criticizing someone's words or actions is not cancel culture. Cancel culture is going after their entire livelihood for a non-criminal infraction, perceived offence, or difference in opinion, often with no route to salvation. The former is fine, the latter is evil. And that really sums it up brilliantly, I think, because people are so ludicrously overreacting to almost everything that happens in this world now.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, people are overreacting to stuff that is not worth the outrage,
right?
And they're underreacting perhaps to things that are genuinely worth the outrage. There are legitimate problems still going on in the world on a local level, national level, international level, which are certainly worthy of outrage. But we live in this time, in this culture, where a lot of that gets expended on total nonsense, to be perfectly honest. And I think that's actually one of the downsides of this sort of outrage culture that most people don't really think about, is that it distracts away from some of the real issues that people should be aware of and should be tackling.
Sure. Do you think the politicians that are around nowadays have some sort of blame to take for this, because they seem to be quite shallow in lots of ways. And I'm not suggesting that back in 2005 they were any less shallow, but they seem to be particularly shallow now.
Yeah, look, I'm not a big fan of the blame game. I think we as individuals all need to understand the role that we all play in it, right? And none of us are perfect, but I think whether someone is a politician or in the media or a public figure or just someone who's has a Twitter account or a Facebook account or whatever, I just think people need to think more responsibly about what they're doing. You know, we live in this time as well where people just read headlines and then they share things and amplify things just after reading a headline which might be misleading. And we live in this era of clickbait where lots of media outlets are being paid on ad revenue. So they're just trying to generate clicks, even if it means being misleading or telling a little bit of fake news or being extremely biased, etc. So we need to firstly recognize that, but then not play the game in such a stupid fashion. And that's something that I personally very much try to do. I try to be level-headed and sensible and not just run on emotion, but run on what makes sense.
Yes.
And not try to play into some of the divisive narratives that people like to push.
Yes, and I mean, I think we all know that there are people out there who don't do what you've just described, and I think that's why guys like yourself are so valuable in that kind of social media atmosphere, because effectively you have a bigger audience than most massive now newspapers used to have. I mean, I worked for newspapers when they used to have millions and millions of people reading them. Now they don't. Now they're mostly below 1 million. They're down to sort of 500,000 in some ways. If you've got a Twitter account reaching 500,000 people, you know, not only are you reaching those people, but you are able to influence those people because they're following you for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. And I try to be responsible with that power. You know, it's like I said, my account has grown from 18,000 to over 300,000 just on Twitter in 18 months. So that's crazy. And I'm still sort of getting used to how to handle that. Right. It's not an easy thing to do as a single person. But, you know, I try to be as responsible as I can. I try to be optimistic. I try to give people hope, positivity. I try to unite rather than divide. And sure, I'm sure I make my mistakes and I'll make more in the future. But I really do my best, whether it's in my music, my podcast, my social media presence, or just everyday life, to be a positive impact. I think the world needs that.
And are you somebody that has a kind of team of people? Because I know a lot of people in your situation would have a team of people around them. I don't get the sense that you do that. You seem like a fairly well-balanced individual. You seem to know what you want, where you want to go, how you want to get there. Do you find yourself asking advice from people, or do you have sort of close allies that you can kind of generate thoughts with?
In terms of my business, I am a complete solopreneur. I don't have a manager or a label or sort of anything behind me. I do everything independent, and I always have. But with that said, I have a fantastic family. I've got fantastic friends. I've got people around me who I can bounce ideas off or get honest feedback from, and people who just help to keep me grounded as well. So I think that's something that really helps.
Right. And growing up in Saudi Arabia must have been an interesting experience. I mean, I suppose as I would describe you as a black man in Saudi Arabia, how was that exactly?
Yeah, I mean, the black man part, I don't know how much that played into anything, but my experience there was very positive. I lived there for, in total about 19 years before coming back to the UK permanently. But I've been back and forth between the two countries a lot. I've been influenced by a lot of different countries and cultures. But my personal experience of Saudi Arabia was a positive one. I know that surprises some people and shocks some people because they expect me to talk really bad about it. But that was not my experience.
No, I was just wondering what it was like. Because my daughter actually works in Dubai and goes to Saudi Arabia quite a lot. And as a woman, it doesn't say the sorts of things that I would expect her to say. You know, I mean, she finds it a fascinating place and she finds it very interesting. But obviously, not being a native of Saudi Arabia, it's a kind of a very different culture for her to experience. And since you've been back here and since you've watched over the course of, I guess, the last few weeks and months, the whole Black Lives Matter movement coming from what happened in Minneapolis, what do you make of all that?
Wow, that's a really complicated question to answer, and with any kind of brevity.
We got some time.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to Black Lives Matter, you always need to really parse it out if you're going to have an honest conversation, because there are three things going on there. There is the statement, the phrase, the sentence, Black Lives Matter, which 99.9% of people agree with. Everybody who is decent agrees with that statement, and it's not contentious in itself. Then you have the organization, BLM itself, capital B, capital L, capital M, which is an actual organization with a lot of goals that have nothing to do with Black Lives Mattering. I'm personally very critical of the organization. It has a lot of stuff that they're trying to do there, if you look on their website, that I am not on board with at all. These include things like disrupting the nuclear family and defunding the police. They've got some ideas about dismantling capitalism, etc., things that I think are terrible ideas and which would actually harm Black people as well as people in general. And then you've also got the movement, which sort of sits somewhere between these two things. So a lot of people who consider themselves part of the Black Lives Matter movement, or people who might be out on the street holding up a sign or using the hashtag, etc., many of them will not even be aware that there is an organization called Black Lives Matter, and they just sort of like the phrase, they agree with the slogan, and they want to go out and fight for good. So I have three different views on all three of those things. The organization itself, I am very critical of. In fact, I'd say that I oppose the organization. The statement, I am 100% on board with. I believe that, of course, every single person, every life matters, including all Black lives. I'm a Black man from a Black family. Of course, I support that. And then the movement, I'm somewhere in the middle on. I support some aspects of it. In some ways, I don't think it goes far enough because it's so focused on the policing issue, and it ignores the other sort of 99.9% of situations where Black lives are at risk of danger or are even killed. So I think if you're going to have a movement called that, then it should really be all-encompassing. So that's my critique of it. But with that said, I think it's good to be raising awareness of, general issues around any sort of true injustice. There's always positivity in that. I think some of the methods used could be better, and some of the solutions offered could certainly be better. But, hopefully positive comes of it. I do think that there is a lot of negative coming from it. I don't know how it balances out with the positive, but I guess we'll need to see in the long run.
Yes, I think so. And I think your description of it is absolutely right. But equally, I wonder whether parts of it have become something of a fad. And because of the nature of social media, as you've described it, and also the nature of relatively young people, to me, in their 20s, they have a very short attention span. And I think, this year will be remembered for the demonstrations around the world, in America, in the UK, in other parts of the world as well. But I think in many ways, yes, we will probably move to a better place as a result. But a lot of it will just sort of disappear and fade away, and people will lose interest in going on marches, and people will lose interest in raising their fist in the air and making statues and putting them up in Bristol and having them taken down again. You know what I mean? But some of it just feels like a bit of role playing almost.
Oh, I agree with that. And I think it's also been exacerbated by the fact that people have been locked down for months on end. That's clearly a factor. I think, there would have been demonstrations and protests in the light of the George Floyd killing regardless, but would it have extended as far as the UK and Europe? Would it be going on for so long? Would there have been so much aggression and hostility and emotion, etc.? I don't think so. I think it's been exacerbated by the conditions, and a lot of the responses, especially in the US with some of the mayors and the governors and the leaders, etc. I mean, they haven't dealt with it particularly well, in my personal opinion. So I think as a society, we need to come back to rationality. I think people are stuff is so emotionally driven right now. Yeah. And as someone who's just naturally not very emotional, I find it quite jarring because it also stops problems being resolved when people are just running on emotion and mob mentality and hype, and they're not really thinking about the long-term consequences. Yeah. Then, we just end up with these bad situations and issues where things might actually end up getting worse. Right. So,
I do worry that there are some people who are reacting badly to the debate, and who are sort of taking exception to it for the wrong reasons. But then you're creating kind of more division somehow by becoming hysterical about absolutely every single thing.
Yes, I agree totally. And we see this, like, people get lost in the weeds. You have people fighting over. Someone says Black Lives Matter, someone else says, yes, all lives matter, and those two people end up in a fight, despite the fact that those two sentences, those two statements are obviously both correct. Yeah. Right? If you are a decent human being, we already know that, but people just get lost in this semantics and trying to mind read each other and assume, take the least charitable interpretation of absolutely everything. And that's a big problem with the discourse that's going on.
Yes, I think it is. And there's no doubt that there are those as well who would capitalize on that division, and people who would like to see more division because it's good for business as far as they're concerned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think that's where, media and politicians really need to be held accountable, and where they need to be careful, because I don't think it's quite as bad. I don't think it's as bad in the UK, but certainly when I look at the US, I mean, most of my audience is in the US, and I do stuff out there as well. So I kind of keep a close eye on it, and their media it's just become so agenda driven and so partisan that the media itself has done a lot more to divide America than any sort of politician or individual has.
Well, I mean, Andrew Neil made a very true statement once when he went out to New York for a trip, because he goes there quite a lot. And I used to live in the States for about 10 years back in the 80s and 90s. And he said, he switched on Fox and he saw a TV show with 4 people on a panel discussing how great Donald Trump was. And then he switched on CNBC and he had a panel with 4 people who were telling you how terrible Trump was. And he went, here's an idea. Why don't you take 2 of them from each and make a show where they're actually having a proper debate, which would make sense.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, if you look at who watches what channel in the US, people who watch MSNBC and CNN, they barely watch Fox News, and people who watch Fox News barely watch the other ones. So people just sort of get stuck in these echo chambers where they're just hearing the stuff that they already agree with. And it makes it much harder for them to understand or even consider the opposite side of any argument. And I think that is what really amps up the polarization.
Yeah, it really does. And how are you finding working through the lockdown? Because obviously guys like yourself, I mean, I imagine before this, you would do the odd live show or something. You might go and do the odd performance. How are you making that work?
Well, speaking of America, I've had to cancel/postpone 3 US trips. I was supposed to be there in May, June, and July. So that hasn't happened. But that said, with what I do as a musician, a podcaster, an author, and a commentator, I have been less affected by this than I think many other people have. I am able to work from home as standard when I'm not out touring, as you said. So I've been able to use this time in a positive way. And to be honest, I'm a lot more concerned about, throughout this whole thing, I've been a lot more concerned about other people than I am about myself, both from a health and an economic standpoint. I think I'm in a good position, but I know that this is something that affects millions of other people a lot more. So I would like to see things get back to normal.
Well, listen, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Zuby. Thank you so much. We've been doing it for about 20 minutes already, so I don't know where the time has gone, but I'd love to get you back on again when we've got something to ask you about. But in the meantime, enjoy the weekend, enjoy the next couple of weeks or so, and we'll speak again.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Zuby, thank you very much indeed. What a great guy. We have found, I think, another a member of the Independent Republican, Mike Graham, who can be relied upon to speak common sense, to speak with authority, to speak with knowledge, to speak with opinions, which really do make you think. Because that's what we do here at Talk Radio. Not only are we the home of common sense, but we want you to think about things in a way which is, in actual fact, rational, full of common sense, full of the goodness that the world has in it rather than the badness. And, I'm very, very proud that we can do this and that we can bring you people like Zuby, who's got some fascinating views and some really, really intelligent views on the way that culture is currently unfolding.